Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hi there, Josh Blank filling in for Jim Henson this week on the Second Reading Podcast. Filling in for me, I guess, is Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Thanks for joining us.
Did I sign up for that? Is that how I signed up?
Well, I think you're a much better replacement for me than I am for Jim, but we'll just move forward.
We'll do our best.
Yeah. So I like to think that Ross knows everything about Texas politics because he's done nothing over the last 6 years or so to assuage me of that notion. So no pressure, but I think we'll cover a lot of ground.
You're going to find out there's not very much to know about Texas politics.
That's good for the students in this class,
happen, right?
I guess. So as you're all probably aware at this point, the 30-day special session of the Texas legislature, called by Governor Abbott, convened on Tuesday, first to address sunset legislation, which we talked about or bored you to death over last week. And presumably soon they're going to take on the governor's, other 19 agenda items. So first things first, is 20 items a lot? I mean, like historically, pragmatically?
Historically, it's mixed. The original special sessions back in the day when they were first starting the state, some of those had hundreds of items on them. And they were, writing a constitution and basically filling the law books the first time. In modern history, special sessions have usually been about one or two or three things. There's some existential crisis going on or something that politically a governor wants to get done. And usually there's a very sharp focus on one or two or three items.
That's interesting. I think the term you use there, existential crisis, is really interesting because it's sort of like, what existential crisis are we facing right now that requires...
Well, for 5 agencies, we actually do have an existential crisis.
So that's the one item.
Yeah, if they don't pass the sunset bill, or, as I like to put it, they're not really doing the sunsets of the agencies. They're not reviewing the agencies. They're just changing the expiration dates on the milk cartons and keeping those agencies alive for 2 years. If they don't do that, those agencies fail to exist. So that one's actually, falls into that emergency status. Greg Abbott has taken the opportunity to... well, if we're going to be here anyway, let's do some other things, and added, a list of things that look like they would belong on political mailers in 2018, which, in fact, may be part of the point.
Right, exactly. So, well, what about pragmatically? We'll kind of get into some of the details of this, but 20 items. I guess, historically, they've taken on more items at times, but this just seems like a lot to take on in a 30-day period, given the pace at which the legislature generally works.
There are a couple of problems here. One of them is that many of these items are large controversies that they couldn't settle in 140 days in a regular session. An example is the bathroom bill. Another example is the property tax bill, vouchers, and some other issues that they couldn't get to a resolution of in the 140 days. And I should say at the end of 140 days, they didn't look like they were...
yeah, they weren't close
to a resolution
right.
on them. I think arguably on the property tax bill, that's negotiably close.
It seems like it.
Bathrooms seems to be ideologically different. The House took 2 votes on vouchers and very clearly said to the Senate and to the governor, no, thank you. More than 100 votes in the House. So, and then there are a bunch of issues or a couple of issues that haven't been considered yet. One that really caught my attention was that the governor put a $1,000 per teacher pay raise on the call for the special session. And when you crack into this a little bit and find out what they're talking about, got a hold of the governor's PowerPoint presentation to legislators. And it turns out not to be exactly $1,000 per teacher raise. It turns out to be $1,000 on average.
Right, I read that.
But it's a merit raise. Some teachers would get a lot. Some teachers would get none at all. And it would be funded entirely by local school districts. So if you
was that on the governor's original proposal for that, or is that based on the lieutenant governor sort of?
No, that's the governor's original proposal.
Okay.
There are about 350,000 teachers in Texas, so you're talking in a 2-year budget cycle about $700 million, give or take. And so you're asking the local districts who say they are cash-strapped and don't have the money to pay for this. And then there's a bunch of policy stuff. If everybody in the legislature agreed on this, they haven't had any hearings. They haven't heard any testimony, and you're giving them 30 days to take on a really, really big change in how we compensate teachers. So some items like that haven't been heard yet and would really be a lift in 30 days.
Let me just pinpoint something because I hadn't really thought about this. Or I haven't found somebody good to ask this question to yet, so I'll ask it to you. I mean, as a technical matter, there's a lot of, a lot of the regular session understanding over time has to do with understanding the rules, right?
Right.
How many of those rules carry through to the special session? I mean, it seems like in the House they pass sort of the same rules, but there's sort of, there's got to be 3 readings of every bill. There's supposed to be committee hearings. There's supposed to be public notice. That was a big deal yesterday, right? Basically, in the Senate, right? That they weren't going to have sort of a public notice period of like 48 hours, right? So, I mean, how much do the rules hamstring some of the possibility of even getting through all this?
The rules are, basically there to enable minorities, political minorities in the House and the Senate. So, if you just do things by the numbers, if you've got half plus one, a majority in either place, you could run ragged over this stuff. But they've set up a series of rules and procedures where you can't do this kind of thing very quickly. You have to do this, in this process. And then they have rules for how you override rules. Let's ignore this rule for a while.
Right.
And those usually require supermajorities. Some of them require 3/5 of the members. Some of them require 4/5 of the members. Some require 2/3 of the members, just how they go. For example, in the Senate yesterday, a senator can tag a bill. Tagging a bill basically says, I want to look at this for 48 hours before consideration.
Not unreasonable.
Well, it depends. Right? The lieutenant governor in the Senate wants to hurry through the sunset bill because the governor has said he will add the other 19 issues to the agenda only after the Senate has passed the sunset bill.
Only after the Senate, not
only after the Senate.
Oh, okay.
Right. The Senate's where the sunset bill died in the regular session, so the governor wants to take the hostage away from Dan Patrick and company.
Okay.
So the Democrats in the Senate, who would like to slow things down, tagged it. Jose Rodriguez from El Paso, a senator, head of the Democratic caucus, tagged it. And in a relatively rare move, the Senate overruled his tag, which requires, as it turns out, 3/5 of the members. 3/5 of the members, there's 31 members, there's 20 Republicans, there's 11 Democrats. Guess how many 3/5 is?
Is it 20?
20.
Yeah.
Voted 20 to 11 to override that veto. They sent it, or to override that tag. They sent it to a committee. The committee sent it back. And on the second day, they expect to do a tentative approval of that bill. And on the third day, they'll do a third read. So there's a 3-day layout rule. Just to give you another example here. The thing called the 3-day rule, and it basically says a bill must be read on 3 several days. I didn't write this.
Yeah.
But basically, when you say several days, you mean actual calendar days and not legislative days, right? It takes 4/5 to override that. And the Republicans don't have the Democratic support to override the 3-day rule. So they zip it through committee, they bring it back. That's the first read. Come back the next day, that's the second read. Come back on the third day, which will be Thursday, the third day of the session. They'll do the third read. And then Governor Abbott opens the pantry.
It's really interesting, though. I mean, just even with the least controversial item on the list, being the sunset bill.
It's got 100% approval rate.
Right, exactly. Right. But even if you just kind of lay that out and just think about the rules for that, even assuming that there weren't, let's say incentives for Democrats in particular to delay, and then say, well, now let's repeat that process with 19 other items. It's hard to imagine how you fit that in 30 days.
Right.
So, at this point in the process, the overarching storyline kind of heading into the special session has been this sort of increasingly public acrimony between the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, and the Speaker of the Texas House, Joe Straus. I mean, I guess the question is, and I promise, this is the last historical precedent question I'm going to ask you because it's rude. Is there a historical precedent for this type of event?
Just because I'm old, that's what it is, right?
You just said that. See,
Fine.
I didn't say that. You're older than me.
Wow.
But you're not old.
There's that.
But you're not old, see. So is there a historical precedent for this type of antagonism? I mean, or is this sort of unique?
Yes to both, kind of. There are always antagonistic players, and there are always, rivalries and, people with different ambitions and different politics in these things. Right. Sometimes they don't like each other. Ann Richards and Bob Bullock, sort of famously didn't get along when she was governor. But they managed to work through that. And they managed to push some things through. What's interesting about this bunch, Joe Straus, Dan Patrick, and Greg Abbott, is that the personal animus seems to have bled into policy and into some other things. One of your lead-in quotes into the podcast is Ann Richards saying the Republicans were all in the Democratic Party. There were always two parties here. Well, it turns out in the Republican Party, the modern majority party, there are two parties there, and Dan Patrick and Joe Straus are pretty good avatars for those two parties. And the House and the Senate, viewed, a little loosely, but, it works pretty well. You can look at them as the two versions of the Republican Party. And Greg Abbott's always trying to straddle this. Basically, I'm with this one or I'm with that one or I'm trying to get them together.
Well, and the thing is, something you said there about how the personal antagonism, kind of affecting the politics, or the policy in this case. In some ways, It seems, at least watching this session, part of it is that the personal and the policy really overlapped. I think from the outset, Patrick has really gone out of his way to say, my priorities are the governor's priorities or the people's priorities, and therefore anybody, who doesn't agree with me in this, is basically on the other side.
Right.
And Straus has kind of said, well, I don't agree with all these things, and so he's on the other side. His style in terms of his, desire to win these sort of policy goals, I think, and the personal have really mixed together in a way that has made that relationship obviously super toxic, right?
They meet every Wednesday morning for breakfast. It's a long tradition. The governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker, and lately the controller.
Yeah.
And it's a long-standing tradition. Let's sit down and figure this out. Where are you going? Where are you going? What's happening this week? Blah, blah, blah. It broke down, it turns out. We asked for their records, their calendars toward the end of the session, what's going on here. And it turned out that the breakfast broke down somewhere in April, and they stopped even, having eggs together. So, if they're not sitting down and talking, when you get to the end of the legislative session, when, various parties, notably the governor, were trying to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again and get the sunset bill out and get some other things done, the relationships that you would rely upon to do that weren't there, and the session fell apart.
It's pretty amazing. You kind of think, I always say, there are two things you can't control. You can't pick your family and you can't pick the people you have to work with. So you just kind of have to deal with it.
Right.
And so it's kind of amazing that you have these sort of, pretty accomplished, obviously, successful politicians, and they can't just meet for breakfast.
They have kind of a bullying, and this is true on various levels of politics right now. There's sort of a bullying way about politics right now. It's not collaborative so much as it is do what I say or else X.
Yeah, and you can see that with the recent failure in the U.S. Senate of healthcare, right? That's sort of a good example of that, where Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said, here's the bill, take it or leave it. And his caucus said, we'll leave it.
Governor Abbott is out with a statement he made on Monday, the day before the session began, to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a conservative think tank here. He said, I'm going to be keeping a list, and I'm going to be scoring the members on how they vote on this thing. And, this was an obvious threat about 2018. It's the kind of thing, it's basically a do this or else.
Right.
And without getting into, all of the why he's doing that, you kind of look at how the politics go together. If you're trying to bring people together, you're basically forcing them into a polarity, where some of them you're either with me or against me.
Right.
And he's hoping he's got more than half with him.
I was going to ask you about that later, but since you brought it up, what do you make of that? It seems he's made the choreography of the last week has been really interesting, which is the special session was set to start Tuesday. The Friday before that, Governor Abbott announces his reelection bid. I think on Monday was the campaign finance filings where he says I have $41 million in the bank.
Raised $10 million in 12 days.
Is it $41 million total or 46? I guess he was at 36, and then he probably spent some or whatever.
It's $1 billion.
It's a ton of money. Point is, it's hard to put this stuff into context for people. It's a ton of money.
Right.
It's a huge war chest. So they release those numbers, and then there's this sort of promise to keep the lists of who's with him and who's against him. What do you make of this? And do you think the legislators are sort of taking him seriously? Sort of the context for this, I think, for a lot of people is sort of the last session, right? Mm-hmm. When Abbott the first time pushed sort of a I don't want to call it universal pre-K, but an expanded pre-K program in Texas, which is not popular among the Republican base at all.
It's a strange thing for a Republican governor to go after, but he wants to be an education governor and has said so.
I think you can come up with a reason why it makes sense for him to do it. But needless to say, a lot of members, in his party had to vote for this thing that they knew was not going to be popular back in their district. And the grumblings were, where was the governor in my reelection campaign last time? And so now he's making, I don't think that this really necessarily plays into this current threat per se, but I guess what I wonder is, how seriously do you feel like, especially House members, because the Senate is really kind of, for all intents and purposes, is lockstep with Dan Patrick on most of these issues,
right,
for how we proceed through this. But within the House, how seriously do you think they're taking the governor's threat?
Well, this is another relationship problem. If you go back to that pre-K thing in 2015, toward the end of the session, the governor got the Republican caucus in a room at the Capitol and said, stay with me on pre-K and I will protect you and I will campaign by your side. I got your back in your elections. And they said, reluctantly, some of them, because they were getting flack, particularly from the most conservative voters in their districts. They said, okay, and they went with the governor on it, and he did not back them up in their primaries. And, they remembered that. And they came back. There were several moments during the regular session in 2017, this year, where they came in, they zeroed out his pre-K budget at one point. There were a couple of things important to the governor that they voted down. And in one of those sort of classic Texas House symbolic votes, there was a piece of legislation popped up on a Saturday late in the session by Lyle Larson, a Republican from San Antonio, where he stood up and he said, we got to stop this pay-for-play system. Anybody who gives a governor more than $2,500 in an election cycle as a campaign contribution should be prohibited from receiving a gubernatorial appointment to a board or commission. Because it looks like, Larson speaking still here, it looks like the more you give, the better appointment you get. This is a long-standing commentary, but it's odd to come from one of the governor's own party.
Right.
And more than 100 House members voted Larson. That's,
which is pretty hard. It's pretty hard to pass ethics legislation of any kind, let alone that universally.
It's a big, fat institutional middle finger.
Right.
And that is a pretty good description of where they left the session. And then in the interim, one of Abbott's comments along the way between the regular session and the opening of the special session was, we wouldn't be here if legislators weren't so lazy. So the legislature keeps their own scorecards.
Right.
And they're keeping score on the governor, and they're saying this guy doesn't have our back. He's antagonistic. We'll help him where we have to.
That's a really interesting, that's really a nice connecting of some of the dots over the course of the session, and that sort of relationship in some ways. And it actually makes me sort of think about the question I was going to ask you in a different way, which is, I was thinking about, does Abbott, so I should say this. Abbott's basically made a push 20 for 20, which is we're going to pass all 20 pieces of legislation in 20 days. The Lieutenant Governor signed on. He's 20 for 20. And I kind of have been wondering, and before he said that, I had asked this question a couple of times on this podcast and other places, what's the marker for success? Is it 10 items? Is it if we get these 5 done? And then he came out and said 20 for 20. And that was not what I expected because, it's a tall order, as we already discussed. But I wonder, does he even want or expect to pass all 20? There's two things. In some ways, he wins if he wins and he wins if he loses, right? Because even if not all 20 passes, then he can kind of point to the legislature and continue this. But I also wonder, is this about achieving, 20 policy goals that he can take in the 2018 election? Or is part of this about kind of an institutional snapback? Pointing to this sort of line you've drawn where the House kind of said, the governor's, not really a big player in this, and he's kind of, trying to boss us around a little bit, forget that. And then he said, oh, okay, well, let's do that. Let's have a more open conflict then. Right. What is this about in your mind? Is this really about the policy goals in 2018, or is this more, and it could be both, I guess, more about, again, maybe snapping back this relationship and regaining some, at least it's not necessarily respect, but credence, with the legislature in terms of, accounting for the governor?
I think a lot of it is, where do you stand? And you have to view that in the context of the 2018 elections. If you look at a political election or a political year or a political map, it's easy to tell a Republican from a Democrat because they have to declare it. They hang their flag under this banner. If you're looking at a place in politics like the present where one party is dominant and really what you're covering is two parties within a party, just as the elders among us did, when the Democrats were the majority party. You have to figure out a way to differentiate this kind of Republican from that kind of Republican.
Right.
They're not flying a flag. They don't have a red or a blue flag, and it's a little more difficult to do. But if you have a governor or another leader, Patrick is who I'm thinking of, putting down a marker and then saying, are you here or are you there? That marker serves as a guide to some voters, the Patrick voters, the Abbott voters, whoever, when they go into the primaries in March. So if you get a list of 20 things like this list and you say, however these issues come out, this is how the members of the legislature are arrayed ideologically as you go into the primaries and you know sort of who your targets are and who your friends are. That's one way to look at it. There are a couple of things in here that I think the governor would really like to pass.
The tree ordinance.
Well, he's got this list of things. The tree ordinance is actually one of them that are limits on local control. And, Greg Abbott's actually been pretty clear about, in articulating his view of state government. The United States is a federation, and the states should take more power back from that Congress has taken up. This is his call for a convention of states. The states should pull back some powers from the federal government. And the cities and counties are creations of and subsidiaries of the state and have taken too much power away from the state, and the state ought to, land somewhere between local control and avoiding a patchwork of laws. So if you drive the state's highways, maybe there should just be one texting while driving law would be an example.
Right.
So he's got this list of things that are viewed by the cities and the counties as attacks on local control, and by a significant number of legislators, by the way. But I think he would really like to pass those, and I think ideologically, philosophically, he believes those things correctly place the cities and the counties in this lane, the state in that lane, and then eventually the federal government in the other lane.
It's interesting. The way you've laid this out as sort of the marker in the sand thing is interesting, and it's sort of something that's it's kind of obvious. I mean, I don't want to say it's kind of obvious, but sometimes, it needs to be stated. I mean, I've been trying to sort of suss out exactly what's going on here in some ways. And I think, the first place I landed is a little bit different, but it's kind of interesting to put them in contrast, this idea of drawing a line in the sand. I mean, who's with us and who's against us within the Republican Party. One of the things I was thinking about with sort of why do 20 items, why pick the most, basically the most controversial items, and why say you're going to pass them all in 30 days, because presumably you have to back it up. Right. Either, in the primaries or, by calling another special session. And where I came down was, look, 2018 is going to be a tough year for Republicans everywhere. And it's historical. The president's party usually has a tough midterm election. In fact, as things aren't going well for the Republican governing party in Congress, it's unlikely that what the trajectory that we've seen with the Trump administration and Russia and everything is going to all of a sudden just resolve itself.
Not to mention the trajectory of all of our predictions about what would happen with Trump for the last 18 months,
well,
right?
And I'll say that too.
Anything could happen here.
Anything could happen.
Right.
But originally I was thinking, well, maybe it makes sense to lay out a pretty aggressive agenda because you can say, hey, look, you can you can quarterize yourself in some way from the National Republican Party, which Texans have been pretty good about doing. I mean, and Texan public opinion itself actually makes this distinction pretty well between, like the Republicans in Congress versus the state legislature and the people here. And so part of my thinking was, well, maybe what they're doing is they're looking ahead to 2018 and saying, look, there's all this dysfunction, but we're still doing, basically fine here in Texas. We're still running. And, in some ways that argument made a lot of sense to me. But the way you lay that out is sort of drawing a line and saying between who's with us and who's against us, that also makes sense. But those two goals are kind of at odds with each other.
Well, so you have to look at kind of Abbott's local problem. And, various people, different observers put different stock in this. I think the greatest threat to Abbott in Texas politics, potentially, is Dan Patrick.
Right.
And the question has been for a long time, is Dan Patrick going to challenge Greg Abbott? And Patrick's gone out of his way, sometimes even without being asked, to say, I'm not running against the governor.
Right.
But every time he says that, it's sort of a, why did you bring it up? When you draw that line where the governor drew it with these 20 items, one of the things that did was put he and Patrick on the same side of the line. And as the us.
I like using the word neutered.
And yeah. Well, he's trying to eliminate any daylight between Patrick and himself, any product differentiation.
He stole his agenda.
Right.
I mean, the agenda is stolen directly from Dan Patrick, essentially.
The primary voter looks at this and says, I don't see any difference. Let's stay with the incumbent. That's Abbott's hope. It also draws, necessarily, and I don't know that it's animus between the governor and the speaker so much as it is the governor's not worried about the speaker and he is worried about the lieutenant governor. It puts the speaker on the other side of the line. So the tension in state government, it's always 2-1 somehow. unless it's working when it's 3-0. You got to pass all three places.
Right.
If it's going to be 2-1, in Abbott's mind, or from Abbott's position, I should say, it makes more sense for Abbott to be with Patrick than for Abbott to be with Strauss.
Well, let me ask you the question I'm really interested in, especially from your perspective, because you just made that point where you always need, at least two of the three, or you need three to make law, two to make politics. Right, exactly. Right. And one of the things I'm thinking about is going back to the threat against House members is there's this sort of, I'm thinking if I'm the average Republican House member. So we're not talking about, and I guess there's this, I've obviously followed this stuff closely, and if you sort of follow what's been going on in the House leading up to this, you can see a lot of, interesting quotes from Speaker Strauss.
Yep.
You can see a couple interesting quotes from some of his top lieutenants, who are basically people who he's appointed to chair committees, and they're pretty much in line with what he's been saying, but maybe a little bit more wiggle room. And then, you either see quotes or know basically what the far right kind of freedom caucus of the Texas House thinks. And they're pretty much in line with the lieutenant governor on most of these issues.
Well, and if you watch them, they're actually pretty outspoken.
So. Right. So they're there. So we know what they think. But I think about, you're sort of everybody else, the average House member. And I sort of am thinking about, there's sort of two things going on, right? On the one hand, you sort of weigh the governor's threats and how seriously you take them, and whether, you take them seriously, and also whether you think there's a negative consequence for you.
Right.
But the other thing is, this is what we call, if we're talking like game theory talk here, right? This is a repeated game. They're going to come back and have another legislative session, and another one, and another one, and another one. And one of the things I wonder is, if I'm your average Republican House member, where do I come down? Because on the one hand, I can basically either be working for the governor and the lieutenant governor and just say, yeah, whatever they want is what we're going to do.
Right.
Or the other side of it is to say, boy, we're a co-equal branch here. We're an equal member in the legislature.
Right.
If we just roll over on this, is this what it's going to be like forever? Because we're going to have to do this again. Most of these people plan on coming back. The vast majority are going to plan on coming back. So I guess what I wonder from your perspective, what are you hearing from, the average, basically Republican members in the House on this? That's not something you see in a lot of the papers.
Well, the great test case here, we actually have a bill that has tested this for months. This is the bathroom bill. And it's a thing, if I am a member of the legislature, I'm a Republican, and the bathroom situation is not something I've really thought about or worried about, whether transgender individuals in Texas use the bathrooms that correspond to their gender preference or their biological sex.
Right.
And when
that's one of those politicians are people too. They haven't thought about this much either.
Well, they haven't. And, when we did our first polling on this, then the UT Texas Tribune poll,
that was good. You plugged the poll, not me.
Yeah,
we can stop now.
See how that works? Yeah. There was, you could tell that a lot of people were like, what? They just hadn't thought about it. Didn't really have a position on it. If I'm a member of the legislature and I really don't have a position on this, this happens on any number of issues. And sometimes on those, I'll just say, well, where are my voters? And this is where this gets really interesting to me. A lot of their voters are on the side of regulate this bathroom use, should correspond to biological sex. A lot of their supporters and the businesses in their communities are against it as employers and as people with clients. So on behalf of their employees and their customers, are against it. And if I'm a Republican member and I don't have a strong feeling about this that overrides everything else, I would like for my constituents to be harmonized on this. And because they're not harmonized, a lot of members are in this very awkward position where they are telling Joe Strauss, for example, if this comes to the floor and I have to vote in the open where my voters are watching me, I'm going to have to vote for this thing. But I don't want to vote for this thing because the employers are against it. I think they're probably right. I think it's a bigger loss there than it would be a win for the voters.
Right.
But I also want to come back in 2 years. And frankly, if I vote against the voters on this thing, they'll replace me, and whoever replaces me will come back and vote the way they wanted to. So, what you're watching in the House has always got something of a protection racket going on. We're going to elect you speaker. You're going to protect us from some things outside. And right now, interestingly, the thing outside is Dan Patrick and increasingly Greg Abbott asking them to vote on an issue where their voters are split.
What's really, I'm going to make one observation and then one more question for you. What's really interesting to me in all this is with all the focus on the bathroom bill in particular, it's sort of a missing the forest for the, trees element to all this, which is, I can make one prediction accurately about the special session, which is a bunch of really conservative stuff is going to pass.
I don't know that that's right. I think you're going to pass a sunset bill.
You don't think there's going to be a lot?
I think you're going to pass a sunset bill, and there are a couple of things that are easy to pass. There's a maternal mortality issue in there. There are a few things that I think the members will find non-controversial and easy to pass. The House and the Senate don't agree on bathrooms. They don't agree on property taxes. They don't agree on school vouchers. And these are issues where, with the exception of school vouchers, the governor has not planted his flag. He wants a bathroom bill, but he hasn't said which version. He hasn't said which version of property taxes. And until they get some kind of confluence, takes all three, they're not going to pass this.
That's interesting. I mean, in some ways, your prediction then would almost be like an abject failure. I mean, to actually really take on this agenda, if that's how you think this is going to go.
I think the way to bet is against all 19 issues, knowing that some of them will get through, rather than to say all 19 of these should pass and a few might not. The surprises are going to be the ones that pass.
Yeah, see, I would think, somewhere, I mean, I have to look at the list really specifically, but I mean, I sort of felt like going to the session, like I knew sanctuary cities was gonna pass. I mean, we'd been talking about it for session after session after session. The bathroom bill had already come up. The House had already been pretty clear they weren't going to do it. The voucher issue is another one where the House has historically been against it, continued to be against it. And you kind of knew in that context there was no way they weren't going to deliver on sanctuary cities. And I think if you were to look at I know I have to look at the 19 a little more carefully. I just imagine it would be hard for me not to see them passing 4 or 5 pretty conservative pieces of legislation so they can say, see, we did it. We agreed.
I think
where
they could pass 4 or 5 things. I don't know that they're going to be on the conservative end. They're not going to be the controversial issues. The big ticket items here, the headline items here are the hardest ones, and that's why they're the headlines.
That's interesting, though, because then that makes it a really tough next move, right? Does the governor call another special session? Does he try to proclaim that it was a success? Or does he just sit back and say, well, you know what, the legislature is dysfunctional and I'll see you later. And then Patrick says, yeah, the House is dysfunctional.
Right. And then this is all a forward to the 2018 elections. And I think to a large extent, it is a forward to those elections.
Yeah.
And, any of the 19 issues that don't pass are certainly going to be on the plate in 2019 when the legislature comes back for a regular session. So part of the question here is, how long can the governor call people back to work on issues that they can work on in 2019? How urgent are the voters about this?
Yeah, well, and at some point, the other side of it, too, is, it's not a costless move on his part, right? I mean, if he calls repeated special sessions, eventually it looks like he's doing something wrong.
It's about $1 million a pop. Every time you do it, you spend about $1 million.
I think we'll stop there. I have more questions I want to ask, but I think we've talked a lot. I think it's a lot for everyone to absorb. Ross Ramsey, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we will see you again next week.
The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project and the Project 2021 Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin.